Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Nancy Duarte is a communication expert who has been featured in Fortune, Time Magazine, Forbes, Fast Company, Wired, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Cosmopolitan Magazine, and CNN. You might have heard a few of those before. Her firm, Duarte Inc., is the global leader behind some of the most influential visual messages in business and culture. As a persuasion specialist, she cracked the code for effectively incorporating story patterns into business communications. Duarte Inc. is the largest design firm in Silicon Valley, as well as the fifth largest female employer in the area. Nancy has won several prestigious awards for her communications and entrepreneurship and was recently honored in Watermark's Women Who Have Made Their Mark ceremony. Nancy has 30 years of experience working with global companies and thought leaders, and she has influenced how the world perceives some of the most important brands and entities, including Apple, Cisco, Citrix, Food Network, GE, Google, HP, TED, and the World Bank. Her own TED Talk has over now 2 million views, and Nancy is the author of 6 books, which includes her latest, one that we'll be diving into today, called DataStory, Explain Data and Inspire Action Through Story. Nancy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
I'm out of breath, but I told you it'd be an impressive opening.
I was like, I could give you a couple lines and we could get right into it.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm glad because it is certainly impressive, and I'm really excited to have you on. And I explained why when we were first chatting, but I will say it again because we're on the record here. You're the first guest, now guest 20 actually, which will be the 20th guest of the show, who is a little bit outside the technical field of what we call behavioral designers or behavioral scientists or behavioral insights, behavioral change experts, whatever you want to call it. And yet, there's this behavior and persuasion and human element that obviously runs through all of the work that you do and have been doing for decades. So you're sort of that first guest in that style. And you've stood out to me for years now on the different socials and LinkedIn, because that's where I sort of hang out and waste most of my time. And it was there that I saw you were talking a lot and just linking to your various pieces on stories and storytelling. And data is data, and we know that everyone's sort of talking about it these days. But we didn't evolve this cognitive capacity of ours to be engaged and to get motivated by looking at spreadsheets and numbers. No, we actually evolved sort of to tell stories and to listen to stories. So it's sort of this thing that runs deep within us, more than almost any other behavior that I can think of. So question, just to kick it off, what draws you, or what drew you when you sort of started this venture? What draws you to storytelling and to story?
Well, it started out of curiosity because my companies, we've written and produced presentations, visualized speeches and taught people to deliver them well. And I knew that the greatest speeches of all time had some sort of a rise and fall, this rise of tension and cathartic release. And that I wanted to figure out if there was a consistent pattern. So I guess I'm a behavioral pattern finder, if you want to say that. So I wanted to see if there was a pattern in the rise and fall. So I literally had a book called The Greatest Speeches of All 100 Greatest Speeches of All Time. And then I thought, I think the answer is in storytelling. So I went on the most magical, most special, most meaningful journey of my life. Is for 3 years. I woke up at 4 a.m. and until 11, I just researched story structure, story patterns, read stories, looked at Russian fables, and I just went everywhere, even into Stanislavski's an actor, all of his methods. And so it was really quite the journey. And then at the end, I found a pattern that's based in stories that the greatest speeches had. But that journey rocked me, changed me. Now story is a lens through how I communicate, how I love, how I approach roadblocks. It's just become a real beautiful structure for me to have as part of my life.
Hmm. That's amazing. And what, if you don't mind taking us back, what was that your first book that you wrote?
No, actually, interestingly, Slideology was my first book because we'd been making slides for 20 years for people
Right.
and so I just took that was like anthropologically observing what my team did and just writing
Mm.
it in a book because if you don't, that was 2008. If you don't remember, but back then, like the presentation software, the default slides were so ugly. I mean,
Hmm.
just the default. Everyone made ugly slides unless you were a graphic designer. And so it's kind of the first time visual communication was put into business language. And so Slideology still sells really well. And then Resonate, my second book, was when I got way deep into story. And now all my books, every book I will write in the
Hmm.
future, will always have a component or an insight lifted from story just because man, it got in me. Like it's just part of me now.
Hmm. And what is that sort of, if it is a secret sauce, or what is the underlying psychology of story that the structure? And it reminds me of, I remember this video that I saw years ago, and I just had to quickly Google it. It's a Kurt Vonnegut. It's like 4 minutes
I love
long
it.
on the
Yep.
shape of stories, and it's just
Hmm.
classic Kurt Vonnegut with his like
Yep.
cutting humor. So yeah,
So
like
funny.
along that vein, what is it about, like, those 100 best speeches that cuts across?
Yeah. So what's interesting is I actually I kind of put the whole transcript of the Vonnegut speech in the
Hmm.
DataStory book. I don't know if you've seen that yet.
I
I'll find the
haven't yet.
page. Oh, it's on page 187. So
Okay, I'll
it's
flip
in
to
here.
that.
So the Vonnegut it's great because it's a lecture where he lectures on a chalkboard about the rise and fall. Right? It's this rise and fall that story does that he was trying to say. Look, I think these stories rise and fall, and we have computers today because this was what in the 70s, I think it was 60s, 70s, because we have computers. Why doesn't someone feed all the stories into a computer and confirm that stories rise and fall? They follow a plot, and he made the XY axes and all that.
Mhm.
Well, literally 18 months ago, or maybe 20 months ago, the Computational Story Lab over at Cornell University fed 1,600 stories from the Google Gutenberg project
Mhm.
into a computer and found that there are 6 story plots. They all rise and fall in some shape. They rise or fall, or they fall, rise, fall, or they
Mhm.
fall, rise, but they all follow this rise and fall. And I think and I know that that rise and fall is that building of tension and then releasing it. And that's what we love about stories. Like, oh my God, are they going to do what I wouldn't do that. That's dumb. You're constantly like
Mhm.
cheering this person on as you're like gasping at a dumb decision they made. And
Mhm.
stories are made up of a 3-act structure. That's what Aristotle said. And basically has a beginning, a middle, and an end. If you look at our movies today, about the first 10% is the setup, 80% is the conflict, and 10% is the resolution. Like
Mhm.
80% of the movies is the guy trying to get the girl, misses the girl, barely kisses the girl, fights a monster,
Mhm.
digs himself out of a pit. Like it's just a lot of action packed into the bulk of our stories. So the way stories become a coping mechanism for me in life is I'll look at a situation and be like, oh, I know. I'm just in the messy middle of my story.
Mhm.
It's not resolved yet. It's really about, oh, this, and some stories may stay unresolved for a long time, and some I'm just desperate to seek resolution to. And so that kind of sense of, oh, there's a beginning, there's a messy middle, and it will resolve. Now, some stories, which
Mhm.
the Computational Story Lab found, some stories end in what would be called a classic comedy or a tragedy. Some have a positive resolution or a negative resolution. And so that's like life. And it's like data. So I equated,
Mhm.
what about data that just goes high and to the right? Is there a shape to that? If your data follows one of these classic story plots, you can have it, unveil it with dramatic appeal and have, even though the data is the same, how you unfold it could create an emotional reaction in the audience. So it's about that rise and fall.
Mhm.
Speeches are about that same rise and fall. There's something about that tension and release that keeps people's interest.
Mhm. Is the that's fascinating. Is the positive I'm literally just furiously jotting down notes as you're talking. Is the positive versus negative resolution that you said there, is that like the Shakespearean or not Shakespearean,
Mhm.
but tragedy versus comedy? Is that the
Yeah.
sort of idea?
Mhm.
Ah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, some people think comedy means it's hysterical,
Right,
but
right.
comedy simply means positive resolution, and tragedy means a negative resolution.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Cool. And I often think about this because I will more often than I'd like to admit have to watch some what I think is a very boring rom com with my wife and talk about like predictable storyline. Like I can to the minute predict when that sort of the climax is going to happen, like that's sort of the ultimate peak of the conflict, and then the resolution. Like I know exactly when it's going to happen, I
Mhm.
just don't know what it's going to look like. And yet,
Mhm.
even though it's so predictable, and it's in, like I said, in most stories it's going to follow some variation of this, even though I've seen it again and again and again, I'm still drawn in. So do you think is that testament to how I hate this word, but hardwired story and storytelling is in our psychology?
Yeah, you recognize the pattern, right? So, films, books, movies that are inconclusive don't resonate in a Western hemisphere, but they do in an Eastern. Like in Eastern books and movies, everything's either inconclusive or tragic.
Hmm.
So I think it is, some of it's our upbringing about why almost every film has some sort of a positive resolution, at least in the Western Hemisphere. But it's funny because at the end of your question, you said, oh, I hate to say it's hardwired into our brain, but I'm sure you know this because they're hooking fMRI machines up to the brain now
Hmm.
while a story is being told. And there's phenomenal results that are happening from
Hmm.
that. Things like while you're telling a story and I'm listening to you tell a story, our brains will tick and synchronize and share the same emotional
Hmm.
charges in our brain. Like
Hmm.
it is interesting, and we'll actually suspend our critical and analytical side long enough to kind of accept alternate perspectives, and it's just a lot going on. So you're right. I mean, I think a lot of it's behavioral, right? If you asked a 3-year-old, their brain might not fire the same way, but
Hmm.
it is getting wired in, I think, through our societal connections and
Hmm.
just how we communicate, and even the media, the amount of media we watch, I do think is shaping our psyche and behavior.
Hmm. It reminds of us. Just last week, actually, a new study was released, and I might be butchering it, but I'll do my best here to give the Coles notes of the methods and the results. So what they were interested in seeing was when you bring two strangers into the same space, the question is what factors go into predicting whether those two strangers will hit it off and sort of like each other, become fast friends, or have the opposite and just like a terrible first impression. And we could all, I think, relate to that intuition or that question. So the researchers did that, but what they were specifically interested in was sitting two people down and watching a show on, I think it was on Netflix. And then they had a very brief period of time where they could talk to one another, and then they just answered some questions of like, how much did you like this person, and do you see yourself like contacting them again, and just sort of as proxy towards them being friends. And what they found was the biggest predictor of them liking each other was their synchronized timing and reactions to the story
Oh, I
or to
love
the
this.
show. So it was
Wow.
actually the facial expressions that were shared at that exact same time between person one and person two as they were watching the same story unfold. So to your
That's
point.
so funny. We have a really old and not very popular movie that my family, like, if we're like, do we want this person to be part of our family? We literally put this movie up. And if they're not laughing when we're laughing, we're kind of like, I'm not sure they're a fit.
What could you
You're
disclose the
gonna
movie?
die. That's here I'm supposed to be the story lady. But my whole family thinks that the movie called so I married an axe
Oh
murderer.
yeah, with
You
Michael Myers.
Yeah, everyone
Canadian,
in the
yeah.
family thinks it's hysterical, like snot laughs still. And so if they're kinda like, "I don't get it," or they're not really laughing, that's so funny. I didn't know there'd be science behind it. I'm gonna go find that
There
study
you
and share it
go.
with my kids. They're gonna die.
I'll share it with you, and I'll put it in the show notes for
Oh,
sure.
that'd be great.
It's funny you say that. I remember this is years ago. I was in high school, so I was a teenager. My older brother, who wasn't much older than me, he brought home his girlfriend. He was seeing a new girl, and it was sort of the first official one. He wasn't like a type of guy to bring many partners home, and so we were all like, "Oh, this is exciting," and we were going to meet her for the first time. A lot of sort of stuff was up in the air of whether it's going to be good or bad. Anyway, so had this movie on. I think it was either like Meet the Parents or Meet the Fockers. Which Meet the Parents is,
Mhm.
I think it's a funny movie, and maybe it's up for
I think it's
debate, but like
funny.
it's
It's
hilarious.
funny. It's
And
funny, yeah.
and this person, this like partner, this new girlfriend, didn't even crack a smile, and I'm not
Ah.
embellishing. And I was this whole time I was just looking at the movie, laughing, and looking at her, going, "This can't be good." Anyways, they lasted about a couple months. So if that means anything.
That's
Okay.
awesome.
Well, let's get out of personal stories before we really find ourselves in trouble. You've been in the you've been in the business for 30 years, right? It was 1990.
Yeah, 31 years. Yeah,
31
yeah.
years.
Mhm.
So you've seen it all. You've gone through the internet revolution, the dot-com bubble, the financial crisis, now this whole rise of VCs and the Silicon Valley startup, and now the other side of that we're seeing, and digital revolution and AI and data and data and
Yeah,
data.
yeah, yeah.
So how how much has changed? How has it changed? And specifically when it comes to storytelling and data.
Wow, that's a really good question. I mean, I have most of your listenership probably wasn't born when I started my business. So the rise and fall of the dot-com bubble was a fascinating season because it was a dream. It was a pipe dream. And sometimes I reflect on those early dreams and the bust and I just thought this is ridiculous. I can't believe people really think it's going to do it because it was so young, right? The internet, like the apps, everything was so young. And we did a lot of IPOs. We helped because back then it was software and nobody really knew how to visualize software. So we could
Mm,
take and make these graphics and really make it look like a real sturdy product. And, we would help people try to explain during pitches to get funding or to go public and stuff. It was quite the race. And yet then after it crashed, I felt really bad because I could tell, like, we knew which products were real and a hit and which products were just BS.
mhm.
BS, I was asking for BS. Which ones weren't, and then I was like, "Well, did I play a part in this fueling of this fantasy?" But now I'm on the other side of it. Almost every idea that I thought was fantasy is now kinda come true, like, it's really, really happening the way the promise was, but that was 10, 20 years ago now, I think, right?
Mhm,
Is
mhm,
it 2000? Yeah, 20 years ago, my goodness. Today I would say that AI, the thing that's interesting about things like AI, so this rise and fall with VCs, with people making bets, with tons of money flying around, it's a fascinating place to be.
mhm,
It's really hard to be a business in the Silicon Valley right now, medium business. I have 140 people, and more than half of them have moved outside the Bay Area. So there's this weird phenomenon where it's really
mhm,
hard to live here,
mhm.
but it's an exciting place to live here.
Yeah.
But the technology advances are fascinating, like, AI is fascinating, VR, AR, all that, but the thing about AI and something like data is data can make an observation. Sorry, AI can make an observation about data. It can make an observation. So Tableau, you can put quarterly sales information in Tableau year over year, and it might say Jimmy Bob's sales in Q2 are lower this year in Q2. That's all it'll say, but
Mm,
you put the data in and it tries to suss out, "Oh, I think you probably wanna notice Q2," and it'll do some pre-work for you.
mm,
What data will never be able to do for you is make the right decision about Jimmy Bob's next steps in his career, right? It
mhm,
can't. Like,
mhm,
it can only point out a problem or data can point out a opportunity, but it can't tell you what to communicate because of that, how to rally the humans to change their behavior because what the data said. And so that's the cool thing is that Jeff Weiner did a study where they fed all the resumes into LinkedIn because they have them and all the job openings. And then they looked at the skills gap, and it says communication by far, bar none, number one skills gap. And of the number one skills gap, the number one skills gap in the category of communication is oral communication.
Mm.
It's a gap, and there's not enough people with strong oral communication skills. So that's why instead of the book Data Story being about, well, how do I explore data? How do I analyze data? How do I synthesize the data? It's like that all that data is for naught. Like all the work you did around the data is for naught if you
Mhm.
don't know what to communicate because of what you found in the data. And so that was why this felt like the right time, because everyone's running around crying, oh my God, is my job going to be replaced by a robot? Or is my job going to be replaced by AI? Well, why don't you work on your communication skills and let's see how the future pans out for us, you know?
Yeah.
So
Now, just to hold you there, I've pondered this often. Do you think communication skills, and in particular oral communication skills, do you think that is a, when I say the word skill, like it's something that can be trained and changed and improved, um, compared to, like, say, something that's a more technical skill like data analytics, or even a more advanced technical skill like programming? Or is it the opposite that I've heard, and some evidence to suggest that this might be the case, is that it's either you got it or you don't, to some degree. Now, I don't think that's the case. I think there's some degree of it being trainable, but then at the other side of it, there's folks who it's just almost like they have it from the very beginning. What are your thoughts on that?
I would say I would say some people, because they're extroverts, have a little more natural charisma than
Hmm.
some who may be, I don't want to stereotype, but some who may be a little bit less, there's a lot of people who won't jump up in a room and start to wave their hands and be excited about
Hmm.
something.
Hmm.
What the difference is, so I'm an extrovert. Like extroverts, they're just like, oh, they're so comfortable. They don't plan. They don't sit and stop and think and say, and they're not as thoughtful as someone who's an introvert would be. The most powerful combo is someone who will stop and pause, be really thoughtful, think empathetically about who they're talking to, and then have the guts and the bravery to stand up and deliver that message. I tend to be the spokesperson for the company. I tend to just do fine in a Q&A. Whatever you ask me, Nick, I'll just like react to. And my husband has a harder time doing something like that. I'm telling you right now, my husband is the stronger communicator. He's more thoughtful, he's more planned, he's more intentional. So if you can get him to stand up and talk, his people's jaws are on the floor. So it's all I don't think it's really about, say, charisma or comfort. Now, there's some people that are terrified of public speaking,
Yeah.
just really terrified. But what we've seen with TED, if you look at the early TED Talks, some older timer TEDsters crave these days where this geeky scientist was up there so scared. I mean, legs are shaking, look, just doesn't move and just stands there and shakes, but has the most brilliant things in the world come out of their mouth, like just brilliant. It can be so staged and so contrived, it just doesn't seem as real. But now they have the same geeky scientists up there with a little bit of work, a little bit of shaping, and a little bit of coaching. They're getting millions and millions of views. So I don't know, right? It depends on how passionate you are about the message. Do you care about the message enough to work hard to make sure how you communicate it gets traction?
Hmm.
And that's really kind of what it's about. It has to almost come from a place of passion, because it takes that kind of work to do a really good talk.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I agree. It's something that I've been working on for years, and when I was in the world of academia, there was often this debate where, um, there'd be a scientist, a behavioral scientist, who is, an excellent scientist and a great empiricist, and could collect data and analyze data, and write amazing papers, and be on paper a fantastic psychologist or scientist.
Mm.
And then it came time for them to talk, to present their findings, even if at a brown bag meeting or at a conference. And some of these scientists who weren't as good, or who were really nervous and scared, um, were frustrated that this had to be a part of the whole game of science.
Mhm.
But my opinion, and I think the opinion of a lot of people in the world of academia and outside, is that needs to be a part of it, because otherwise it's all for naught. You're sort of just
Yeah.
collecting data, and I mean, I guess they're writing a story in the form of a paper, but there's something about oration, there's something about speech that is so much
Yeah.
more powerful. You're
Well,
right.
it's got passion. I think it's got the human element, right? You can see, whoa, this guy's real fired up about that geeky scientific thing, you know?
Hmm.
And besides, if you write all these papers and then they don't go anywhere, like, if someone wrote a paper on the way to cure cancer, or they cured cancer on the way to the moon or whatever, it would be really sad to have it be trapped somewhere. And so many movements start with the spoken word, right? Some impassioned person does an impassioned plea. Now we have, granted, we have social media mechanisms and way for passion to spread today that we didn't have in the past. But
Mm,
if you're so geeky about your, cancer curing science, that you cannot have a conversation to get that idea to spread in common enough language that it gets funded, or common enough language that people start signing up for the trials, or that's the role, is like it goes nowhere without
hmm,
strong communication.
hmm. Agreed. Agreed. Um, and now, before data, before all this that we find ourselves in, before sort of serious digital infrastructure and digital products and software, and I guess before anything that resembled this evidence-based, what I hear now, evidence-based management and evidence-based decision making in within organizations. um, how were leaders arriving at their decisions? Because in your book, you really sort of emphasize this point that the data is there as a you have a metaphor with like Obi-Wan and Luke Skywalker with the Force.
Mhm.
Um, this is really a tool or a weapon that we have to use at our disposal, data. But
Mhm.
before we had this, in the early '90s, what were leaders and what were managers, the decision makers, what were they relying
Yeah. Nobody's ever asked me that question. I love it,
on?
because what's so funny is we're so hooked on data. I think it's actually slowing business down.
Hmm,
Um, so I didn't have data. I had hunches. I had historical financial data. Let's just say, right? I had historical financial data, and I want to go this direction, and I would love my future data, my future financials to look like this, right? You just went forward. And now it's funny. My exec team will all agree on something. We'll say, yes, it feels right. This is the greatest way to do it. And we're all in agreement. And then somebody will be like, do you think we can get data to support this decision or whatever? You're just like, ah, yeah, sure, we could buy a study, we could go buy a massive database, we could swizzle the database a million years. But I sometimes kind of miss the days where it could just be like, I have a lot of conviction, let's just go this way. And people just won't do that anymore. They're like, well, prove to me that I should move that direction. Well, prove to me. Well,
hmm,
the future has no data yet. So you have data, it's all historical. Somebody turned on their internet of things, somebody opened their refrigerator and closed it. Like, we have all kinds of data that we could use. Well, you have to change human behavior. So you have this historical data. Oh, I want people to open the refrigerators 100 more times in the future. Well, they're only opening it once a day today, and I want them to open it 10 times a day in the future. You have to do a whole bunch of behavior change to get to that new number in the future.
hmm,
So data is historical. And then you say, well, what do I need to do to shape human behavior to get them to create the data that I want in my future? And so, but not everything matters. I think probably only a small sliver of the data we collect today even matters. It even really drives humankind.
hmm,
And so it's funny how now it's like, okay, well, let's make sure everything's perfect and we're headed the perfect right direction in the future. Well, there is no perfect right direction in the future.
hmm.
You always start tomorrow with a hunch of how you'd love it to turn out, but it never turns out the way you want exactly. And so it's just,
So
yeah,
we
it's
should.
funny. I'm so glad you asked that question.
So we should be using, like, of course we're not going to abandon it altogether, but we there's a limit to what data can do for us. And then beyond
Mm.
that, is it conviction? Is it storytelling? Is it these things that aren't necessarily related to data? Is that the way you see
That
it?
I do think, yeah. I mean, I think there's some data that is a historical trend that could continue in the same direction.
Mm,
Um, I think there's ways that data serves a purpose. Once you get the problem or opportunity you were looking for out of the data, then you employ storytelling. You
Mm,
shape that data in the shape of a story. So
mm,
that's why I took a finding from data, and then crafted it into a 3-act story structure. Quick. It could be 10 seconds, it could be 20 minutes that you go on about this 3-act story structure, but there's a way to shape it so people will take action. So what's interesting, what I did to get to these conclusions is obviously been in business, because you said it, for 31 years. We have also worked with the number one and number two brands, the highest performing brands in the world in almost every vertical category. So what I did is I pulled thousands of just the data slides from the highest performing brands, just data,
mm,
and I pulled apart what were all the parts of speech. What were the conjunctions? What were the verbs? What were the adverbs? What were the adjectives? What was the noun? And figured out this kind of taxonomy around, like, oh my gosh, really, there's a lot of that on there, but the most important word in there was the verb. What were the
mm,
actions that the highest performing brands associated with data, and why? And so then I started to just kind of peel all of that back. And literally, a verb is a behavior thing, right? You're trying to
mhm,
get someone to take action. And that was just this really powerful moment where I started to realize there was kind of different energy to the different types of verbs and the scale of what you're asking people to do from the data. And that all kind of can drive how you shape your communication around the data.
mm, mhm. So back to leadership and these sort of maybe if there is a change in leadership, do you think that the shift towards data and perhaps even it as a double-edged sword where we're often you know over estimating the use of data, do you see that it's changing the landscape of leadership and leadership talent? Whereas before
No,
you could sort
no,
of have gotten into that leadership position without
no.
that. Is it different now?
That's a good question. Yes, I think it's very different. Like, you look at somebody like my top creative gal, she's been with me for 25 years. So she used to be able to do just beautiful conceptual work and really like meet with clients and could draw what comes out of their mouth while they're talking, and just like fiery hot beautiful graphics. Now she spends about a third of her week in data in Excel.
Mm,
And so you wouldn't think, right? But that's what she has to do, right? To optimize the department, to find underperformers, or to, just
mhm,
data is just everywhere. And so I do think that and I think it's a bar some people in organizations don't want to cross. And so they may not rise up. So everyone in my company who's a manager and above this year, we have the skill of financial acumen. Every single person here, we're a small business, so I don't have to publicly share our information, but everyone
mhm,
here has to understand all the line items in a P&L and
mhm,
what drives our profit so that they can help control it, right?
mhm,
And I never would have thought I would have to do that, but we're doing it. And even my execs at a higher level, they all have to understand exactly the flow of money, how it hits, what it does, and all that. So I do think it does, because now that I've got a really high performing exec team, everybody is really kind of leaning in and understanding that my biggest barrier in growth has been this kind of gap in really, really understanding more the financials than data itself. But we're not that big of a company. We
mhm,
do collect a lot of data. I have a lot of information here I
mhm,
can use to make decisions. So
mhm, mhm. Yeah,
if that really answered it, but
yeah, no, it does. It definitely did. And I'm working with a client now where where I initially came on, they didn't even realize the extent to which, they had this data and that they could use it. And then I
mm,
kind of was like, whoa, like there's this and then there's this. And they're like, oh, right. We forgot about that. And I was like, yeah, you should probably be sort of utilizing this to your advantage and making decisions based off of it. Um, but you're really okay. So I'm a trained scientist, and so I'm sort of I over anchor on data and evidence too
mm,
often, I think. And you're really sort of checking my bias here, which is a good thing, because I've just this week I've been thinking a lot about and collaborating on a couple pieces with other scientists on this idea of getting rid of intuition. Intuition's bad. Gut hunches are bad because they just lead to faulty decision making, and they're rife with our own biases, and they lead us astray, and they're can do things like bias and discriminate, blah 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 blah. But you're saying you're sort of putting a positive twist on intuition. Yes.
I do. I think data only takes you so far. You can get analytical stuff, but what's interesting that's happening in society today is our ability to cultivate an imagination almost. Is kind of squashed, right? It's like, oh, well, there's a lot of political correctness. There's just a lot of things going on right now that kind of are shutting down this more out of the box thinking kind of
Mm,
mindset. So when I look at data, when I collect data, um, I would say there's been twice in my career where doing a completely counterintuitive move to the data was the right thing. Absolutely the right thing. Now, if I was a robot or a machine, I would not have done that. And it was like one of the most defining moments in my history was when the dot com crash was happening. It was going down immediately. 25% of my business was gone. My big, great clients just weren't calling as much. And it was like, I had a year's worth of cash to burn through. And instead, back then we did, print, web, multimedia, and presentations. So you would think maybe I would jump out and do two extra creative things for people, but it didn't. I shut down 3 out of 4 of the services we did and decided
mm,
that I would focus only on presentation. Counterintuitive, not
mm,
what people would do. Counterintuitive.
hmm hmm
It was my gut. And I remember telling my husband, I can't even remember what it was, maybe because of course, I'm on a podcast, can't remember. So I look like I don't know what I'm doing. But recently I made another really massive counterintuitive move. And we both agreed it just was the right thing to do. And I wish I could remember it because it was really recent. But that's the kind of thing that your intuition, once you're in the groove, once you're doing your job or your role, you sometimes have to just use your gut.
hmm It's 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 right. It's true. And actually, just I'm now thinking out loud. I'm thinking through this as I'm hearing you speak. There's the famous book now, Danny Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner, sort of economist, Thinking Fast and Slow, and he and some of these other folks who my listeners will know very well, helped to bring applied behavioral science to the masses and outside of the walls of academia. Um, and Kahneman's whole view, and has been even before he kind of got famous in the eyes of the public,
Mhm,
was
mhm,
that we have these biases, we have these heuristics, or these sort of mental shortcuts that we apply that are evolutionarily highly adaptive. They sort of allowed us to navigate the complex world that Homo sapiens had to exist in for millions and millions of years. But he says he's sort of the underlying assumption in his work is that these heuristics or mental shortcuts are flawed, are quote unquote irrational, that they
mhm.
lead to bad or worse outcomes. Now, contrast that with another researcher in the similar space. His name's Gerd Gigerenzer, and he has this theory called fast and frugal. And he actually says, yes, we do have these heuristics, we do have these biases, they're evolved, and they're actually highly adaptive still in contemporary modern society. So he has some really cool a lot of different studies and lines of evidence showing that intuition, the fast and quote unquote cheap decision, cognitively cheap decision, is actually going to be better, but not only because it's faster, but it actually can be more accurate, because you're relying on that expert intuition. So the one important caveat to that is they tend to be good. They tend to lead to good intuitions, tend to lead to good outcomes when we have accrued enough expertise and knowledge. And that's the
I,
important caveat there.
yeah, I agree with that. Yet, I everyone has their own lens that they look at life through, right? So even based on my political beliefs or religious beliefs, or I mean, there's a whole lot of reasons why people may choose into it a certain direction or not. But I also know that there's just some people that are genius at it. I had a lot of friends that worked directly with Steve Jobs, and they would prepare and put big. They would do proposals like wrap a room in concepts and ideas and all this stuff, and spend months, right, preparing something to present these new concepts or products and all, or marketing campaigns and stuff like that. And
Mm,
he'd just walk in, look around, and then something so intuitively off everyone's radar, just like shoots out of his mouth and he would leave, right? It's just like, what? Just whip the whole thing around on its head and do the opposite thing. So some of that, I mean, you could say it's from years of it, but it's also just, I think cultivating, I call it like, well, I didn't name it this. A guy named Walter Brueggemann came up with the concept of a prophetic imagination.
Hmm.
But it's this concept of, can it be cultivated? So I did a Jeffersonian dinner at, are you okay? What happened?
That was my dog.
Oh, tell him hello. Um, I did a Jeffersonian dinner at TED where they just gather a bunch of TEDsters, and that was the subject, because is a prophetic imagination. Are you born with it or can you cultivate it?
Mm-hmm.
And it was just an interesting conversation, because I don't know if you will ever know, right? If it's cultivated or you're born with it, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. I'm gonna have to mull that one over. I think you might have actually changed my mind. I'm now more artist, less scientist
Well,
after this
you just never
conversation.
know, do you?
It's the conflict part of my
Well,
story, I think.
creativity, so much creativity comes, I don't know, so much creativity isn't.
Study that I was looking at today was looking at what helps us, be creative, to perform in our job creatively and to be innovative. And they pitted that against the common narrative nowadays that's saying multitasking is bad, switching between tasks is bad. We need to engage in deep focused work to be at our sort of best in the work we do. And what they actually found was multitasking and switching between tasks can help us be more creative, not less. So it's I think it gets at this point that the hyper rational, the analytic, the data, like that side of us and of human nature has its merits, but we can't forget the others, the conceptual, the creative. Like
Mhm.
there's a whole other side there that we might be at risk of missing or losing out
Yeah.
as we sort of progress into this field of data, into this
I
era of
think
data.
everyone's different, right? I mean, having written 6 books, each of them took a different kind of energy from me. When I wrote Resonate, I would just study, I would just write until I was stuck, and then I would go on a
Hmm.
walk, on the trail. We have a little walking trail, and then I mean, I would be 5 minutes in the walk, and something I was stuck on for 2 hours would just come to me, and I would run back to my office and
Hmm.
write it. DataStory was 3 years, 16 hours a day, sitting on my butt in a chair, right? And then I figured out I have different energies. So my morning energy is my creative energy, and then my afternoon is interrupt driven. It's back and forth, hummingbirding
Hmm.
around and
Hmm.
going to meeting and stuff like that. And but yet there are times where I needed to change my place or my space or be at my desk. And then part of it, because I wrote a case study for the Data Story course, really stuck on the course, really stuck. I couldn't break this case where all the data added up to these different outcomes or whatever. And so that particular case, I stood up in the sunshine in my jacuzzi, pretending I wasn't working, trying to think, right? So I think it just depends, right? You got to know yourself. And I think that's the biggest thing, is know yourself, know when your best creative
Hmm.
output is, know when your best analytical output is,
Hmm.
and and cultivate what you need in the
Hmm.
moment.
Hmm. And optimize your day around that. That's great. And I do the same thing. Right? At
Mhm.
least I try to do the same thing. Okay, a few more questions if you don't mind. Some rapid fire. That's okay.
Sure.
First, what's your favorite data visualization, data graph, if you had to choose one?
There was one that was gripping to me. I mean, say its favorite, it was the one that made me gasp. And it was, and I started to use it in the course, and people were just too upset by it. And it was really well done. And it was a visual of different bombs that landed in, I think, Pakistan. And a little white dot would travel across it. And when the white dot hit the ground, subterraneanly, data, little bar charts would grow as dots, and they were different colors. And it would say, how many military, how many civilians, how many children were killed in
Wow.
that bomb. And it would just go choo, 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 choo. And they were just dropping. And it was just building in real life. It's really graphic.
Wow.
And I think that it kind of anthropomorphized, like it could have just been a regular old bar chart. But the
Mm,
fact that the bomb hits the ground and it was subterranean plotting of these dots in colors, it was just, it's powerful. It's one of my favorites
wow.
I've ever seen.
Okay. And that's really neat. What's your favorite story?
I would have to say my favorite story is the Uber narrative, the Uber narrative of my faith. And I think there's spiritual stories and constructs that a lot of people aren't comfortable talking about.
Hmm.
But I would say I would say it's that it's the Uber narrative from the creation story to how we're going to be redeemed at the end of our life. I think that's the perfect story structure that I feed off of
Great.
every day.
Great. And
Yeah.
last, who's your favorite storyteller?
I would say today, outside of my husband, who is he's super shy, but he's hysterical once you get to know him. I would say my favorite, who's a speaker slash storyteller, has got to be Scott Harrison. He's the CEO of Charity Water. And
Yes, yes.
so his
I've
own
heard him.
origin story is so beautiful. And then he went into a season where he was just like fatigued, right? And he went back to Africa and found a story that gripped him again to fuel him, right, for another decade of storytelling. And I just think that he's just so powerful and so beautiful, and you can't even be in a room with him without being moved in some way.
Yes, I heard him, I think this is a couple
Mm.
years ago on a podcast, and I hated the host of the podcast I was listening to. I was like, this guy is awful, but who is this guest? This guest is remarkable. And I remember this vividly. I was like doing house chores around the house, and I was listening at the same time to this podcast interview, and I was just totally captivated by
Yeah,
his
it's
what he was saying.
beautiful.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's beautiful.
I will link to that, and I definitely
Mhm.
encourage listeners to check him out. And finally, the last question, BBB, the big behavioral brainstorm, or maybe the big storytelling brainstorm. Where do you think, of all the problems that we sort of face now, where does behavior or storytelling, sort of, what could be solved using that approach?
My organization is trying to solve something and it's big. And I would like to say that story can solve it. And that is, we're trying to transform millions and millions of people to be strong communicators. It's not the
Mm,
money that drives us, it's not the prestige of who we work with that drives us. It's the promise that if we build and make these amazing courses and content based on the work that we've done for these really high performing executives and brands, it really will make a mark on the earth. And we're already seeing that. And I hate to, I mean, I had that question for a while, and I was like, I'm not saying it to be like promotional by any means,
mm,
but picture a world where millions and millions of people were strong communicators. That's the world I want to live in.
mm.
And that's going to be a hard one, right? That's going to be a hard one to change, but that's our goal.
Yeah,
And
it's a
I'm
great.
hoping we get there. Wish me luck.
Yes, no, it's a noble pursuit, and when I was teaching, I haven't been teaching in a while, but I would teach these fourth year seminar classes to honors psychology, neuroscience students, and I'd say, okay, guys, like 50% of your grade is going to be this one oral presentation, and I mean, automatically they would hate me so much, but
Yeah.
I resonate with that because I agree. I think it's something that is sort of going to take us into the future, as they say. Um, but Nancy, this
Yeah.
is this has been great. I really appreciate
Yeah, it's
you
really
you coming
fun.
on. Yeah, and
Super
thanks
fun.
for telling me and the listeners your own story. Much appreciated.
Yeah. It was very fun. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS Podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, Keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.